Good evening, friends. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us online as well. I'm Bill Gettler. I lead the Transformational Leadership series at Yale Divinity School. And tonight we've begun a class on Transformational Leadership, Black America and the Unfinished Work of the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm so pleased to welcome our guest from afar, a new friend on the Yale Divinity School campus.
Thank you,
The Reverend Dr. Kevin Cosby is the senior pastor of St. Stephen Baptist Church, the largest African-American church in the state of Kentucky. Dr. Cosby was also inaugurated as the 13th president of Simmons College of Kentucky in 2005 and has led the school to reclaim the original campus lost during the Great Depression and expanded to 3 campus locations. Simmons College is thriving and now has more than 700 undergraduate and graduate students. The college was established by former slaves. In 2014, Simmons was recognized by the U.S. Department of Education as a historically black college and university. Dr. Cosby is widely regarded as an influential leader in the state of Kentucky and across the country. At the invitation of Muhammad Ali, he served as one of the eulogists at his funeral in 2016. He was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers at Morehouse College in 2017. He's the author of 6 books, including a biblical commentary on the American descendants of slavery entitled Getting to the Promised Land, published by Westminster John Knox Press. Joining the conversation this evening with Dr. Cosby is the Reverend Dr. Greg Mobley, Professor of Hebrew Bible and Congregational Studies at Yale Divinity School. Dr. Mobley joined the YDS faculty in 2015 after 20 years of teaching at Andover Newton Theological School and at Union Theological Seminary. A well-loved professor at Yale, Dr. Mobley is an ordained Baptist minister and a seminary classmate of Dr. Kevin Cosby.
That's right.
Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much.
So, who is Kevin Wayne Cosby?
An emerging, evolving person who is a product of the grace of God and the black community, the best of the black community. I am a product of the black community.
And who is part of the household of the Reverend Dr. Kevin Wayne Cosby? Hear more about your family and background.
I have been married for 45 years to my high school sweetheart, Barnetta Cosby. We have 2 adult children and 3 grandchildren.
Wow.
So I'm very happy, and I told my wife that if she ever leaves me, I'm going with her.
So the title of the class you're teaching, and part of the title of the book you've just written, your latest book, is The Unfinished Work of the Civil Rights Movement. What is the unfinished work?
The first phase of the civil rights struggle started with the Brown decision of '54. It took off among the masses in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, 381 days of depriving the apartheid bus system of black patrons. And that continued until 1965. Martin Luther King said that that first phase was for the fight for decency, that blacks wanted to be treated in a humane way. So he says, the fight for decency. And then he says, but the second phase, beginning in 1966, was the fight for equality or equity, or being made whole economically. So just like in the Hebrew Bible, there are 2 kings, 1st Kings and 2nd Kings, in a sense, there are 2 Martin Luther King's. First Kings, the fight for decency. Second Kings, the fight for economic empowerment. What good is it if you have the right to a hotel or the right to a restaurant, but you don't have the economic resources to check out of the hotel or to pay for the meal? You are still excluded. And the reason that blacks do not have the resources is because of the legacy of 246 years of chattel slavery and 100 plus years of semi-slavery, Jim Crow and Jane Crow and segregation and redlining that has totally maldistributed wealth and power in the United States. And for the last 2 important years of Dr. King's life, he was attempting to close the economic gap. So the unfinished work of the civil rights struggle is the work of economic equity.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just mentioned First and Second Kings, and you have crossed paths in your life with some giants.
Yes.
And Bill Gettler earlier alluded to your relationship with Muhammad Ali. Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about this with some of us last night, but I wish you would share some of your experiences and impressions with arguably 2 of the most important and significant global figures of the 20th century, Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali.
Absolutely. Muhammad Ali lived in my neighborhood. So he lived in the west part of Louisville. The church that I attended during my middle school, it's called junior high school then, high school years, was the church that he attended prior to his conversion into the Nation of Islam. In fact, his mother still was a member of the church. His father painted the mural over the baptistry, Cassius Clay Sr. And when his mother passed, I eulogized her. When Muhammad Ali passed, I was one of the eulogists at his funeral. And we had a great relationship. And whenever we came together, because I was a minister and because he was still searching, I believe, like we all should be, trying to come to a better understanding of truth, that we would engage each other in, on the Bible. In fact, one of my favorite pictures with Muhammad Ali is a picture in which we're sitting at his mother's house on his sofa with a Bible open, in which he's trying to point out to me the contradictions that are in some of the Old Testament passages. And when I tried to explain the quote-unquote contradictions, he looked at me and said, "Do you know what I did to Joe Frazier?" So, yeah. Now, in terms of
I have to say, he liked to spar.
He liked to spar. He did. In fact, I'll never forget, he would tell me, "Hold your hand up." And then he would spar and flick his wrist down against my hand. And I tried to do it. He said, "You're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong." But it was, I think, one of the great honors of my life to have been asked to be one of the eulogists for Muhammad Ali.
And let me say that that speech Kevin gave is on YouTube. And it is eloquent and powerful. And I recommend that to you. Just go on YouTube and put in Kevin Cosby, Muhammad Ali, and it'll come right up. Now
the second person you mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr., his brother lived down the street. He was a pastor in Louisville, A.D. Williams King. And my mother was the piano teacher for the King kids, Vernon King and Darlene King. One day, I was running in the basement and running around the corner of the basement, and they're sitting next to the wall, and next to in a chair was Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr., and not paying attention and running, I tripped over their feet. So it was Martin, and my mother straighten me out about that. But Daddy King and Martin Luther King Jr. were both in my home, which I think highlights the type of community that existed, even quote unquote, during legalized segregation. That to have on my street on Martin Luther King's brother, A.D. Williams King, to have in close proximity and in vicinity to me, Muhammad Ali, it was a reflection of what type of community that I lived in.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think, is it fair to say that it's kind of a model for you of the kind of healthy black community you'd like to see?
Absolutely so. I cannot get out of my spirit and out of my mind those experiences of childhood and the cultural, academic, economic diversity that existed in the black community that was forced upon us because of the laws of segregation. And one of the unfortunate consequences of how we engineered integration in the United States was that it created an unfortunate chasm between black professionals and the black masses, which is what the brilliant sociologist and historian W.B. Du Bois warned us against. He said it is the responsibility, in his essay on the talented 10th, to be the yeast in the dough for the black masses. So as yeast causes dough to rise, the intellectual and social capital of black professionals causes the masses of blacks to rise. When the yeast is gone, then it flattens.
One of the things I've always admired about you, because when we were classmates, we get assigned reading.
Yeah.
But you're a lifelong learner and a voracious reader, especially of biblical studies, theology, sociology, history. Tell us about some of the things you're reading now and what have made an impression on you.
Well, in the book of Revelation, they were crying because no one was opening the book. And I think we should be in tears when people don't open a book. Some of the things, I'm trying to be as broad in my reading. I do read theology. And the wonderful thing about reading is that it is an adventure. It's a serendipity because you read one thing, and then one thing you read will send you into a direction to read something else. And so you say, let me check this footnote out. And before you know it, you read that, and then you're led to something else. And it all begins, I think education is basically, it starts with inquisitiveness. You know, that's the first step towards education. You don't have to teach a child to want education because children, it's part of their innate cargo, that children are born with that innate desire to learn, to know. They're inquisitive, they look at their hands. You know, when they get older, they start asking questions. One child asked an exasperated mother this and that, and the mother said, don't you know curiosity killed the cat? And the child said, well, Mom, what was the cat curious about? But it starts with the innate desire that God has planted in all human beings to want to know, and that is universal. Now, it does require regimentation because vocabulary words are not innate. Math formulas are not innate. Learning Greek in seminary was not innate. So it does entail some regimentation. But the starting point for learning, I think, is curiosity. So therefore, I think a good definition of a scholar is not that the scholar is smarter than the other person. It's just that the scholar has never lost their curiosity, their sense of wonder.
But now tell us something you've read recently that made an impression on you.
I'm presently reading a book, several books. I'm reading a book on J.H. Jackson, who was the iconic president of
National Baptist.
the National Baptist Convention, a relook at J.H. Jackson. I'm reading a book on William F. Buckley and James Baldwin, and they had a classic speech in England at one of the premier universities there. I'm reading about that, and reading also a book by a scholar on Birmingham, the Birmingham movement, Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy, and it's called 10 Days That Changed America. And it's a fascinating book about how they were able to desegregate the most segregated city in America. So I'm sure there's some other books that I'm reading.
No.
I have them on my desk and I'm perusing. But as I said, I'll read one thing and then something else will catch my attention in the book.
Well, one of the things about Kevin today, as he's gone through the Div School, there's often books on display, books by various professors. And every time he'll stop and he'll take a picture. And, that's how you're flagging future reads.
Yes, that and also rereading with new lenses and with maturity. Because one thing, you may read something when you're younger, but then you have to reread it as a more mature person, and you get something totally different from what you read. I think what fascinates me about Yale is that all of the scholars that I read, I'm looking at all these pictures on the wall, like there's Letty Russell in here, and Richard H. Niebuhr, and Christ in Culture, and Halford Luckett, and all these persons whose scholarship influenced me. And my God, they're right here at Yale. So you don't have to be at Yale to experience the best of Yale. You don't have to be at Harvard to experience the best of Harvard. Wherever you are, when you have the curiosity, want to grow, to learn and read, those books are so available now, especially because of the internet.
Yeah, if you have a library. Well, no, now you have the web.
Yeah,
But I used to
web.
think, if you have a library, you can get an education.
Yes, you can get this.
But tell me about some of your impressions of Yale Divinity School. You've been here, 8 hours, but it just seems like you have drunk deep and you have had all your consciousness fine-tuned to receive information.
Well, I think it reinforces in my mind one of the great crimes of the United States, which is getting worse, and that is the Grand Canyon of wealth disparities. Because as the president of a historical black college and university, we have a microcosm of the wealth that Yale has. So it burdens me that we're not more humane in the sharing of opportunities. The big divide, and that's what King was talking about, is the wealth divide. And for a person who is committed to a black agenda, I define a black agenda as those who have the power in the black community to help bring wealth, resources, and opportunities to the least of those who are among us. Now, how I'm going to do that, I don't know.
Well, forgive me, but I've been accompanying you and paying attention all day, and one of the things we did is we attended a chapel service today, and it was in the Episcopal style. And we're both Baptist, but I think it's fair to say we stood in awe before the beauty of that liturgy, and we were able to receive the gift of communion. And there was a moment in that service when it seemed like something touched you.
You did.
Would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, you were gracious enough to give me your handkerchief because tears started to well up in my eyes. And I, at that point, decided here at Yale to recommit myself to something that I am committed to, and that is the least in the black community. And I thought about one of my friends, and was a parishioner of my church, named Tony Milan, who was gifted and brilliant, but grew up sucked up by the currents of poverty in the community in which he lived, who never had an opportunity. And he was trying to escape the undertow of poverty, but he couldn't escape it. And I thought, Lord, I commit myself to the Tony Milans so that when I return from Yale, I will, to my context, I will continue to be an advocate and to seek allies so that the wealth that God gives is not bottlenecked in certain institutions. And to me, that is the essence of the gospel. The Lord's Prayer, the power of the Lord's Prayer is the plural pronouns. Not give me this day, but give us this day. A poet said you cannot pray the Lord's Prayer and once say I. You cannot pray the Lord's Prayer and once say my. When you pray the Lord's Prayer, you must pray for another. For when you ask for daily bread, you must include your brother. So the essence of Christianity, to me, is your brother, your sister. You're an Old Testament scholar, but I know that Joseph told his brothers, he said, you will not see your brother's face unless you go and bring back Benjamin. Don't come. He says, until you bring your brother back. The king said, you will not see my face. And there's something metaphorical about there. God saying, don't come to me if you don't bring your brother back.
Yeah, that's part of, I mean, you, in your latest book, Getting to the Promised Land,
Promised Land, right.
which is itself a quote from King.
Yes.
Your jumping off place in each chapter are stories from the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
But you make a move in this book. You say you're going to move from an Exodus hermeneutic to a post-exilic restoration hermeneutic.
Yeah.
And tell us more about that and what those terms represent.
Well, when you think of the starting point for black liberation theology, James Cone, who wrote Black Theology and Black Power in 1969, that the central theme is the Exodus. And I like that because being a product of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Evangelical School, the starting point was Matthew 28, 19, and 20, and the Great Commission, which was often a pretense for white colonialism, white domination, and white normativity. So the fact that Cone would center theology in the Exodus, which is the experience of blacks, even in their hymnody, even in the spirituals, go down Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go. So I applaud him moving and shifting the center of theology to the Exodus account. However, because of diversity today, I think that the starting point for black theology today in 2025 is the post-exilic period in which the Hebrew people, or they would be called Jews then, of course, Jews, found themselves interfacing with multiple ethnic groups. And that while the Exodus account is really Moses, Pharaoh, post-exilic is how do you survive as a people among the nations. So for me, I think it's important that Black Americans differentiate themselves. What is exceptional and distinctive about the Black experience? Because when Dr. King talks about in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, and he's talking about economic repair, then when we talk about economic repair, I think the first question is, who is it that needs to be repaired? And for me, those who need to be repaired and those whom Dr. King is talking about was people who can trace their lineage, their ancestry back to slavery. And these are the people in my book that I'm calling for to be repaired. Now, that is not to say that other groups who have been disinherited should not seek repair. They should. I think women should seek repair from patriarchy. I think those in the LGBTQ community should seek repair. I think that brothers and sisters who are the victims of colonialism should seek repair. Be it in Africa or the Caribbeans, they should seek repair. But each group has their own unique claim for justice. And I think that Black Americans have a unique claim from the federal government. We're the only groups in America who I would not classify as immigrants.
Well, and you're part of a movement whose acronym is ADOS. So why don't you tell us about that and what that means?
ADOS was founded and conceptualized by two brilliant scholars, Yvette Carnell, in fact, who lectured at Yale, did a podcast at Yale, Yvette Carnell, and Antonio Moore. And basically they're saying that if you talk about repair, which was Dr. King was talking about, Dr. King said in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, those who have been the victims of special mistreatment should now be the victims or the recipients of special treatment. Now that contradicts neoliberalism, it contradicts Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton and his neoliberalism said that, total contradiction of King, said that no equal opportunity for all, special opportunity for none. And by special opportunity, he is saying that we must have universal programs that does not target specific groups who have been damaged and harmed by America. I disagree with the neoliberal critique. So I think that Dr. King would say, and he said it on numerous occasions, when asked, why is it that other groups can come over to this country and do well? What is it about the quote unquote Negro that keeps him behind? And Dr. King says, because we are the only group that has been in this country for 246 years without a paycheck. And then the freedom we had was, to quote Frederick Douglass, was freedom to starve, freedom without land, freedom from the elements of nature. He says that he believed, Dr. King quoting him, in a person lifting themselves up by their bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to tell a person, a bootless person, to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps.
But ADOS stands for what?
American Descendants of Slavery. So those who can trace their lineage back to slavery. When I check the box for the census, I should be able to check in 2030 that I am of an exceptional category because I am a descendant of enslaved people. And up until 1965, 99% of all blacks in the country could trace their lineage back to slavery.
And we were talking about Abraham Lincoln, and he can be controversial, but as he said in his second inaugural address, 200 years of unrequited toil.
That's right.
And that is a beef.
Yes, that's a beef that we've attempted to ignore, attempted to deny, attempted to hide, attempted to minimize because of who's telling the story of history. Who gets to tell the narrative is the person who has the power. Controlling the narrative, whoever controls the narrative. I mean, if you ask who's the villain in the Three Pigs, well, you're going to say the wolf. That's because you're pig-centric. I mean, if you talk to the wolf, he was the first wolf in an all-pig neighborhood trying to integrate the pig neighborhood. And he got in trouble for that. So it's who's telling the narrative. And you're absolutely right. America would rather feel innocent than have justice. One of my favorite theologians is Alan Bosak.
Who spoke here about 6 years ago.
Alan Bosak's book, Farewell to Innocence. I think, and I love James Cone, but I think Bosak captures it. You know, I think James Cone said when he wrote Black Theology and Black Power in 1969, that he may have wrote that in a week. You know, so everyone's building off of Cone, of course, but Bosak's book, written in the early 70s, I think captures it, Farewell to Innocence. And basically he says this, that white America has a need to feel innocent.
And in his case, white South Africa.
White South Africans, in his case. So therefore they block awareness of the atrocities in order to deny responsibilities, in order to feel innocent.
Everyone wants to be a hero in their own mind. It is hard to look in the mirror, history's mirror.
Yes, yes, yes. And I don't even think, you know, black people know something's not right. They know something's not right. So it's apocryphal, but there's this apocryphal story of Joe Louis who's fighting someone, and he breaks their jaw, and between the rounds, his trainer says, "Don't worry about it, champ, he never laid a glove on you." Then in the second round, he breaks the right side of his ribs, and his trainer says, between rounds, "Don't worry, he never laid a glove on you." And then in the third round, he breaks the other side of his ribs, and he goes to the corner, and his trainer says, "Don't worry, champ, Joe Louis never laid a glove on you." And the champs and the fighter said, "Well, if Joe Louis never laid a glove on me, somebody used to watch the referee because somebody's beating the hell out of me." Black folk know that something is beating the hell out of them. Mm-hmm. White America knows that something has beat the hell out of them. And white America says what has beat the hell out of black people is either their nature, they are inherently inferior, or it's their nurture, it's their culture. And I will say it's not nature and it's not nurture, it's the legislature. It is public policies that has created disparities. And that's what racism is. Racism is racial disparities created by racist policies that is justified by racist mythologies.
Mm. I wanted to take you back. Well, in a way, the Breonna Taylor season isn't over. No. It still has ramifications in your community in Louisville. But you played a leading role there as a spokesperson for the black community, for the churches, for the civic response against the police department. Tell us what the Breonna Taylor events told you about race relations in our society?
She lived in a very destitute neighborhood, and the no-knock warrant in which the police just barged in her house and just violated her, the neighbors, and reflects the very callous disregard for Black life. I've identified 9 fundamental atrocities that has been committed against the Black community in an acronym called Injustice, my Injustice acronym. And the C in Injustice stands for cops. Every rebellion, quote unquote riot, that has taken place in the United States, from the Watts Rebellion of 1965 to the Detroit and Newark, 1967, all the spark was always police malfeasance. And the same thing with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. What sparked it was, now the counter peg was there, but the spark that exploded the counter peg was police.
Over-aggressive, racialized policing.
But it's all together, because, as you know, it's a scholar, polis, the polis, which means the city. And what comes from that word, the polis, the city? Police, politicians, policies, the poles, all intertwined. The polis has to do with the police, has to do with policies. And all the police do, which have their roots in slavery, the modern day police came into existence in order to patrol the southern states for runaway enslaved people. So the police have always had an adversarial role in the Black community to maintain the social order. So the tragedy of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is that the quote-unquote racial reckoning that we thought was coming to America was a short-lived racial reckoning. Because as soon as a raised consciousness throughout the country and the world about the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, there were forces in this country who did everything in their power to successfully shut down, as Bosak would say, any awareness of racial injustice in order to avoid and dodge responsibility. And they shut it down quick. And here we are, 4 or 5 years removed, and we have a president that is attempting to take us back pre-Brown versus Board of Education. Now, some will say that Trump is not taking us back, that for the masses of Black people, they've never left 2025. So when people say, we've got Project 2025, I heard Dr. Nina Turner, who's a brilliant activist and colleague of Dr. Cornel West. And Dr. Nina Turner said, when has the Black community not had 2025? Jim Crow was 2025. Lynching was Project 2025. Slavery was Project 2025. When have we not had 2025? Project 2025. So the fact that we see the resurgence of white supremacy on the level that we're seeing it, and the pushback against racial justice and racial equity just confirms what people have been fighting against, and that is, it confirms the principles of critical race theory. Because Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, said that racism is permanent. Permanent. Baked into the cake. He said there will be peaks of progress, short-lived periods of success in which white supremacy will soon reassert itself and its dominance. Because it's all about hierarchy. It's about who is in the position of subordination and who is in the position of domination. And from 1619 until here we are, the end of January 2025, has that hierarchical arrangement changed? There has never been a time in my life when the black community has not been in a position of subordination and whites have not been in a position of power. And there has never been a period in American history where this has not been the case. And that is why you can literally unscramble the word America and it will spell I am race.
Now, having said all that, and there's no denying it, then you have your teacher, the Reverend King, who had a conviction, though, that that arc of history was going in a certain hopeful direction toward justice. How do you balance these two truths?
I would say that, as I said, there are two kings in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. There's first kings and there's second kings. That much of the optimism of king is the first king from 1955 to 1965. But second kings, the second Martin Luther King, who wrote Where Do We Go From Here in 1967, when you read Where Do We Go From Here in 1967 and compare that with Strive Towards Freedom, which he wrote in 1957, 10 years apart, two different mindsets. He says in 1967, the dream that I spoke about in 63 at the March on Washington, March for Jobs and Justice, was too naive. And he says that I'm afraid my dream has become a nightmare. And that's because America had not and has never committed itself to the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, and that is economic justice. If you steal my car on Monday and you get saved on Tuesday and you're still driving my car on Wednesday, you were not saved on Tuesday. Because if you steal my car on Monday, get saved on Tuesday, let me tell you what you're going to do on Wednesday. You're going to bring me my car back with new tires and gas and a tune-up. It's called metanoia. It's called repentance. It is Zacchaeus saying, Lord, a half of my goods. And that's redistribution. There's two things Zacchaeus does. He does redistribution and reparations. He says, a half of my goods I will give to the poor. That's redistribution. The only person who went to hell in the Bible was a man who had unredistributed wealth, diabetes, in Luke 16. What did he do to go to hell? What did I do? I didn't do anything, and that's the point. You didn't do anything. And then the second part was he gives to the poor. That's redistribution. And then he says, I have defrauded anyone, I will restore them fourfold. That's reparations. I'm a Lucan Christian.
Now, I want to open it up and see if there are any questions from the audience.
Yes.
I think the point you just made about redistribution and reparations is a powerful one. Dr. King said philanthropy shouldn't let the philanthropists forget about the economic system that requires philanthropy to exist.
Could you repeat the question now that Elisha is there with the microphone and we can all hear it?
Yep.
Thank you.
The point that you were making about reparations and redistribution is really powerful. And Dr. King said philanthropy shouldn't allow the philanthropist to forget about the economic system that requires it to exist in the first place.
I love that.
And as you talked about the black professional class being the yeast, right? So much of that required us to share social capital, economic capital, spiritual capital. And in today's world, we see so much more of us just saying like, hey, the economic capital's enough. I'm gonna give some money away. But when you spend all of your time accumulating that wealth, like, you actually lose a bunch of connections. And so I'm curious, as you think about what the next steps are for us to show up in different ways, for us to show up in community, like, what are the steps that help us to get back to a place where we are sharing social capital, where we are sharing our spiritual capital?
Jeremiah Wright said that the preacher can either be prophetic or pathetic. I like that. And I think the prophetic word for the black community and the agenda for the black community is the reconstituting of black institutions. The black community went from segregation to desegregation to integration to disintegration. Because we went from the politics of exclusion, which is what segregation is, to the politics of extraction, in which we extracted from the black community the very black advocates and professionals that the masses of black people need. And I think that the intersection between the black classes and the black masses took place in black institutional space. So that, just for example, HBCUs, I'm the president of an HBCU. 90% of the students at Simmons College of Kentucky are Pell Grant eligible. So they come from disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged homes. Well, having those kids from disadvantaged homes come in contact with black professionals, and for the very first time, they're seeing blacks in positions of leadership. I'm the president. I have a brilliant woman named Myra Rock, who's a PhD student. She's chief of staff for, my CFO is a brilliant woman. For black young girls in the hood to rise above those defeating images that my sister talks about in black feminism, the mammy images and the sapphire images and the other images. But to see that in black space, I am what I am. When you ask me the question, who is Kevin Cosby? I am who I am by the grace of God and a product of the black community. What I mean by that is that I had Martin Luther King Jr. in my basement. I had Muhammad Ali in my neighborhood. I had F.G. Sampson, one of the greatest preachers ever, right down 7 houses down from me. Now, who's F.G. Sampson? He preached a sermon at the Hampton Ministers Institute, and the name of the sermon was The Audacity of Hope. And there was a preacher named Jeremiah Wright who heard him preach The Audacity of Hope and preached it at Trinity. And there was a senator sitting in Trinity named Barack Obama who heard The Audacity of Hope, and his book is entitled The Audacity of Hope. That man who preached that sermon, that brilliant scholar who Dr. King looked up to, lived right down the street from me. But the neighborhood that I lived in, those persons are gone. And there's no longer any institutions. The institutions have crumbled in our community. And I think that until we can rebuild the 7 fundamental black institutions, I don't see how the masses of blacks their lives are going to improve.
Other questions?
given the new administration's existence at this point, or appointment, there are files of Martin Luther King's that are being declassified.
Yeah.
And there are some who feel as though Martin Luther King's image is under threat or will be under threat under this administration. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that the king that white America loves is a domesticated, housebroken, deodorized Martin Luther King. The last poll that was taken on Dr. King was a Gallup poll in 1966, in which I think he had an unfavorable rating of like 75%. So, to quote Vincent Harding, he's been repackaged. So they didn't like Martin Luther King anyway. They liked a caricature, a false caricature of Martin Luther King. As it relates to him being a flawed man, which he was, I don't know anyone who is not flawed. And for black people, our criteria, I think, will continue to be, what did you do to advance with your flaws, black people, and what price did you pay to advance black people? Now, J. Edgar Hoover was concerned about what King, I don't know what King did when he went to bed. I just know what he did when he got up. And when he got up, buses got integrated in Montgomery. When he got up, a speech was made in Washington about a dream. When he got up, a voting rights bill was passed. When he got up, fair housing was legislated. So, you can always focus in, on the flaws. Michael Jordan missed some free throws, but no one is focusing on Michael Jordan's free throws. They're focusing on his 6 championships. I'm focusing on the championships of Martin Luther King Jr. and how his life transformed the world and what he was up against, the odds that were against him, the pressure. And one thing about Dr. King, I highly recommend, if you want to see a good documentary on King, it's a YouTube documentary called King in the Wilderness. It's on YouTube, the last year of his life. And Dr. King was morbidly depressed, living under the threat of death and, morbidly depressed. And I'm not justifying anything that he did, but I think that to some degree, it was whatever he may have done could have been his drug of choice. But it was the American system of injustice that ultimately did that to him, destroyed his marriage, destroyed his family, the same way with Malcolm X, the same way with W.B. Du Bois, the same way with Paul Robeson, the same way with Muhammad Ali. You name me any black person, same way with Frederick Douglass. Name me any black person who has really advocated for black people, and in some way they have been damaged, they've been hurt. We don't live long.
Who else has a question? Right here.
And where do we go from here? Dr. King has a really striking analysis of science and technology and the role he sees it potentially playing in inequality. And I'm curious how you've seen technology and science affect justice and specifically black institutions.
I think that in terms of the worker, that because blacks tend to occupy the low-skilled, low-wage workers, that there's a great danger of being displaced by technology and innovation. And that is why it is so critically important that if we are truly proponents of justice, that we give black institutions that are serving the masses of black people the resources they need to help them to adjust to a world of AI. But there was always a fear in the 60s that there was a book called Who Needs the Slaves? And basically the book was talking about how this technology was going to displace black people. So until we give the black community the resources, which is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, in our opinion, to help us catch up. And one of the best ways we can do it is through empowering historical black colleges and universities. Black HBCUs like Simmons, we are 3% of the colleges in America, but we graduate over 20% of all black college students. 50% of all black school teachers attended an HBCU. 75% of all black doctors and lawyers attended an HBCU.
What a legacy.
Yeah.
And many of the students here at the Div School attended an HBCU.
Yes.
Other questions?
What has been a meaningful moment in your ministry that gives you hope in this political environment that doesn't seem super hopeful for the black community?
One of my mentors, good question, was a man named Martin Luther King, Mac King Carter. He went to Southern Seminary.
Yes, he did.
The most
And taught.
Taught at Southern Seminary, absolutely brilliant. But he said to me on one occasion, he said, Kevin, until we find out what black folk did between 1877, which was the end of Reconstruction, and 1953, right before the Brown decision, what we did, tap into what we did, that's what's going to save black America. And what I'm attempting to do is to pull water from those wells.
Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance. Most of the black colleges and universities and institutions were built by black people during this era. So what black people did, they closed ranks, they turned to each other, they nurtured each other, they built their own institutions. And what gives me hope is that I see more black people saying that if they don't want us in these public universities because of quote unquote DEI, then we're not going to beg them. Zora Neale Hurston said, when asked how she responds to segregation, she says, I'm appalled. And then she went on to say, and by that I mean, I am appalled that you would deprive yourself of my presence. So if you don't want to be around me, and you're using DEI as an excuse to return back to de facto segregation, then I'm appalled that you would deprive yourself of my presence. And that is why we need black institutional space. And I think by developing our own institutions as we once did, Simmons, Howard, Bethune-Cookman, Morgan State, all these black institutions, what gives me hope is that I think blacks are thinking we need to return to that. And it's something I think that we always should have been doing all along. And the one thing about black institutions is that they're not segregated. So that whites can attend black institutions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Integration does not have to be one way.
Amen. I want to thank you, Kevin, so much for this. And I think we all want to show our appreciation for what
Thank y'all so much.
we've witnessed here tonight.
Thank you.